All right, we are starting now. Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters, and welcome to our second Twitter space where we, Unfreeze Afghanistan, have teamed up with our partners, the Afghan Sustainable Economic Foundation. A month ago, we hosted a space about the humanitarian crisis and the upcoming winter. The recording is still available online. Afghanistan faces a wide variety of climate challenges, including extreme temperatures, droughts, floods, earthquakes, landslides, and avalanches. The event is a conversation with experts and researchers to discuss the impact of climate change in Afghanistan, a subject that has renewed interest in light of first the floods and damages recently and the COP27 discussions. I'm Masuda Sultan. I'm co-founder of Unfreeze Afghanistan, and I'm joined by my co-hosts Tawab Hamidi, the executive director at ASIF, and Michelle Durrani, outreach director at ASIF. Unfreeze Afghanistan was formed by a group of women to advocate on behalf of the civilian population of Afghanistan and to work on the problems they face. We started out with advocating for teacher payment salaries, payment of teacher salaries and healthcare worker salaries, the reopening of all girls and boys schools, and calls to resume aid and the return of the central bank assets to the country. Tabjan and Michelle John, would you like to introduce yourselves before I introduce the panelists?
Sure. Thank you so much, Mr. John. As you mentioned, my name is Tawab Hamidi. I'm the executive director at ASIF. ASIF advocates for, it's an honor to be co-sponsoring this with yourself and the Unfreeze Group for this noble cause and in the company of our esteemed speakers. ASIF advocates for Afghan people in at least three different ways. Hold on one second. Sorry. We pursue for better policy to stop the collective punishment of all Afghans through blanket sanctions and policies, raise awareness on key issues that are affecting the civilian population of Afghanistan, such as this issue, work on innovative models of charity to help empower Afghans economically in a sustainable way by providing them jobs and skills. And we are a non-political group, so we do not take sides other than siding with the Afghan civilians in need. Michelle, if you could introduce yourself, and then we can move on to introducing the speakers as a co-host.
Sure. Thank you very much. My name is Michelle Durrani. I'm the outreach director at ASIF. We have a great panel today and a very important topic, so I'm not going to take too much of your time. But please follow our page, help us advocate for sustainability in Afghanistan, and stay on top of the issues that we bring up. I hope you guys enjoy this space, find it informative. Thank you.
Thank you, Tabjan, Michelle John. The session is being recorded, and we ask that you be respectful to our speakers and to our space. We're going to start with a discussion with each of the speakers for about 7 minutes each, and then we're eventually going to get to your questions, so it will be interactive. So first, let me introduce the speakers. Michael Kugelman, he's South Asia Institute Director for the Wilson Center, and he writes at the Foreign Policy's weekly South Asia Brief. Graeme Smith is a senior consultant for Crisis Group's Asia program, focusing on Afghanistan. Wahzma Frogh is an LLM, an activist, and a peace and conflict practitioner. Dr. Assem is a postdoctoral researcher based in Germany and an expert on climate change. Mr. Mayar completed his PhD in water resource management from the University of Stuttgart. He previously served as a lecturer at Kabul Polytechnic University. Najibullah Sadid is a water and resources and environmental science researcher. He's also a PhD candidate at the University of Stuttgart. He's currently working on Federal Waterways Engineering and Research Institute in Germany. Nasratullah Mateen is founder and CEO of Earth the Lost Heaven. ELH is an Afghan-led grassroots environmental organization based in Kabul, and they have presence in almost every province of Afghanistan. So I'm going to start with Michael. Michael, one of the most notable discussions or decisions at COP27, which is the UN Annual Climate Change Conference, was the decision to create a loss and damage fund for vulnerable countries. Can you tell us more about what happened and the role of Pakistan in these discussions, what that could mean for Afghanistan, which was not represented at the gathering? I see that Michael's a listener. I'm going to see if we can invite him up as a speaker.
I assume you could hear me. Sorry, I lost connection briefly. So thanks so much for doing this. Thank you, Masuda, for putting this together. This is such an important issue to discuss, including in an Afghanistan context. So glad you're doing it. So to your question, yeah. So for quite a few years, many developing countries have been pushing for the adoption of this new loss and damage policy, which essentially entails the richer states, the developed countries, providing financial support to developing countries for climate change effects, because in great part, so many countries in the developing world, including many of those in South Asia, including Afghanistan, have been hit hard by climate change effects, even though they contribute very little to global warming. So Pakistan happened to be the chair of the G77 in China, and G77, of course, is a large group of developing countries. And there was a strong consensus within the G77 for loss and damage to get on the agenda, the formal agenda, at COP27, which for the first time, it had never been on the formal agenda of a UN climate conference. And so there was success in that regard, and then it did get on the formal agenda. And what was even more impressive, and this was quite surprising, is that there actually, even though there were a number of disagreements and agreements that didn't come out of COP27, there was an agreement to get this new loss and damage fund set up. Long way to go before we could actually talk seriously about this fund actually being funded and used. As you could all imagine, it's a politically dicey proposition. And I would argue that just here in Washington, the idea of the Congress, passing legislation that would stipulate the provision of funds to this new loss and damage fund, it's not going to happen anytime soon. So there's going to have to be a lot more negotiations that play out. And certainly, I think that many of the potential funders would be looking for indications that the countries receiving these funds would have safeguards set up and to ensure that the funds would actually be used ethically and appropriately and would not be corrupted. That's going to be a big concern from those that would be funding it. But obviously this has major impacts for Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is obviously impacted by climate change. We know that just over the last few months, there have been some pretty severe droughts as well as floods in Afghanistan. And there are those skeptics that say, "Oh, why would we even want to talk about climate change in Afghanistan right now, given all of these incredibly pressing, dire, immediate crises on the ground, like starvation?" But I think that we could all understand and all agree that, in fact, climate change effects are exacerbating the issues like food insecurity. I mean, obviously, when you've had droughts in the country, that's going to impact food production, and floods have the same impact, and just having major impacts on food supply and food production. And we've heard a number of stories just in recent weeks of desperately poor Afghan families purchasing several livestock to enable them to have some type of food source, and then floods destroying that livestock. So clearly there's a link right there. So the fact that there is a new loss and damage fund to come out of the COP27 is a huge win for so many of these deeply climate impacted countries, including Afghanistan. But you're right, Masuda, that I think that the issue of representation, and I assume we'll get to this later, is really important for Afghanistan. I mean, that is really important in a broad sense. Afghanistan is isolated globally because no country has recognized it because of the Taliban regime being in power. And that means that the Afghanistan, at least now, does not really have a formal voice in these important climate discussions and climate negotiations globally, including at COP27. And I think that there have been efforts by UN officials to sort of step in and play that role. But the Taliban would not accept that. So that's a big challenge moving forward, is the issue of representation. The Taliban is not going to receive a seat in any type of formal discussion on climate change anytime soon, whether at the UN or anywhere else. And I'm not advocating for that to change. I don't think the Taliban regime should be recognized either, but that does pose a constraint, and I think amplifies the challenges for Afghanistan and for the world as well, in terms of how to deliver more assistance that would help Afghans in a meaningful way. It's not just a conversation about humanitarian assistance, broadly speaking, but also about efforts to ease the impacts of climate change in Afghanistan, which again, those climate change impacts, directly impact the broader issues that are being talked about so much these days: food insecurity, humanitarian stress on the whole. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Michael. You focus on South Asia and often analyze the impact of regional political dynamics. Recently, there was an official visit by Pakistan to Afghanistan, led by the Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Minister Khar. Can you shed light on whether climate may have been discussed there, and what potential regional efforts may be underway, discussions, or potential for collaboration or divisiveness through regional politics?
Yes, I think it's unlikely that climate issues were discussed during that visit by Hina Rabbani Kar. I mean, Pakistan has its own interests and core interests when it comes to its engagements with Afghanistan these days. And as I understand it, there was discussion about trade. There was discussion about border security. But I'm sure the big discussion point from Pakistan's perspective would have been the issue of the Pakistani Taliban, which is a major concern for Islamabad, because the TTP's main leadership is based in Afghanistan, and the TTP has scaled up attacks in Pakistan since the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. And the TTP just earlier this week, coincidentally right before Kar went to Afghanistan, announced that it was formally ending its ceasefire and that it was going to carry out attacks across Pakistan. So I think that for Pakistan, that's the main focus right now. I do think that if there's one country out there that has tried to center global attention on Afghanistan's broader needs in a big way based in the region, it would be Pakistan. I mean, it's led from the front since the Taliban takeover, calling on the world to engage more and also to provide more assistance, including financial assistance. It hosted the OIC meeting some months back that resulted in a new humanitarian fund for Afghanistan. But this is really about humanitarian assistance more broadly. So I don't think that at this point in time there's any discussion, certainly not on high levels, between Pakistan and Afghanistan to focus on these climate-related issues. But certainly, I mean, there are a number of linkages. We all know that climate change impacts are borderless, and Pakistan has its own climate change vulnerability. And if you look at realities like the Kabul River basin, or the Kabul River itself, which is a shared river between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and areas that the Kabul River passes through are quite prone to floods and droughts. And so if you're talking about those issues, those climate change impacts, as they relate to the Kabul River in Afghanistan, Pakistan's going to have come into that conversation as well, because the Kabul River is shared by Pakistan as well. So clearly, in an ideal world, if there were better regional relations and Afghanistan and Pakistan had better relations, climate would be on the agenda in a more prominent way. But it simply is not right now, so far as I understand.
Thank you, Michael. We have some more questions, but I'm going to let my co-host move on so we can circle back around.
Thank you, Mr. Dejan. Thank you so much, Michael. That was very insightful. I'd like to call upon our next speaker, Graeme Smith. Graeme is a true friend of the Afghan people and a major advocate to mitigate the current humanitarian crisis related to famine, starvation in Afghanistan, and we're truly blessed to have him here today. Graeme, I've noticed that there are some misconceptions, misunderstandings when it comes to climate change, and there's a narrow understanding of it. If you can provide us a holistic view of climate change and its impact on Afghanistan and the various different sectors, I'd really appreciate it. You can start, Graeme. I'm not sure if you're on mute.
I hope I'm not on mute, Tarab Sab. Am I? Can you hear me
We
okay?
can hear you. We can hear you.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and thanks for inviting me. I am not a climate change expert. I'm not an agricultural expert. So, as usual, I'm the stupid white guy in the room, and I'm very grateful just to be here. And, full disclosure, I have my laptop out, so I can type notes as I listen to the very smart people in this space. And I am not one of them. But as you said, we've been, me and my colleagues at the International Crisis Group have been, some of the voices calling on Western nations to clean up the mess that they leave behind in Afghanistan. Afghanistan was tipped into what the UN called the world's worst humanitarian crisis after the Taliban takeover. And it was a truly enormous amount of humanitarian money that's been dumped into the country over the last, 12 to 18 months to try to stabilize the situation. And there has been, some success in staving off famine so far. But we are deeply concerned that this a huge avalanche of humanitarian aid just cannot continue. And it will not continue. The donors are distracted by Ukraine and other things around the world. And so we really need to be very quickly and very urgently looking at, okay, how can Afghanistan become self-sustaining? Because we can't keep sending bags of food. And so that very, very quickly brings you to the question of climate change, because most of the economy is agricultural. And, so this question of, how can Afghans grow enough stuff to, survive themselves is a moving target because Afghanistan is one of the countries that's most vulnerable to climate change. My colleagues at Crisis Group, we have a really smart data scientist named Ulrich Elberle, who's been doing some modeling of the Afghan climate, looking at the gradual increases in temperature, so about 1.8 degrees Celsius since 1950, and how that leads to prolonged dryness, erratic and extreme precipitation, making Afghanistan very vulnerable to both droughts and floods, right? I mean, both too little and both too much water. And, a majority of Afghans, 80% by one measure, have livelihoods that depend on agriculture. So it's not optional, right? The farmers have to be able to farm, or else people die on a really big scale. And when you talk about sort of how many mouths we're trying to feed, in Afghanistan, we're looking at a population that has approximately tripled since 1990. I mean, the population numbers are not great. There's never been a census, but those are, there's a lot more people to support. And so, yeah, the drought-like conditions that we've seen, we're now in, I guess, the second consecutive year of poor rains. It has a huge impact. By one estimate, a 20% decrease in last year's wheat harvest. Precipitation anomalies, right? Both, too much rain, too little rain. It really makes it difficult for farmers to plan. I was just in Kabul. I met a young man from Zabul, and I said, "Oh, is the drought affecting you?" He says, "Well, actually, the tough part was the floods that washed away our fields. So it's both too much and too little." The IPC numbers that I'm sure you guys are all looking at that sort of measure hunger still show about half of the population in what they call acute levels of food insecurity. That's IPC 3+. It's sort of a clinical way of saying that there's a lot of people just on the brink of starvation. And it's about where we were this time last year. And so some people are talking about kind of a stabilization of the situation, but it's really a stabilization on the knife's edge, because when you have that many people right on the brink of starvation, half the population, then any sort of additional shocks can really, lead to terrible, terrible outcomes. So what to do about it? So we've been asking questions from smart people like you, and I hope to learn from all of you about water management. Obviously crops need water, and there hasn't been a ton of effective water management put in place in Afghanistan in recent decades. What they call Afghanistan's water efficiency rate is extremely low. It's about 25 to 30%, which is sort of less than half the global average. Afghanistan is an upper riparian country, right? A lot of rain and snow falls in the country, and then it moves downstream to the neighbors, to Iran and Pakistan. And so Afghanistan has to capture some more of that water and manage it to become more resilient and to manage its resources more efficiently. And there's been precious little of that. In fact, under the Taliban, some of the little bit of progress that had happened has been unraveled a little bit because they've dissolved the National Water Affairs Regulation Authority, which is a step backwards. And then on the other hand, I guess the Taliban have also provided enough stability for some infrastructure projects to go ahead. And they're very proud, I know, of working on the Kush-Tepe Canal and finishing that project ahead of time. And I've been talking to some engineers who say that actually right now is a great time to build things in Afghanistan because, just easier to move stuff around the country, and the Taliban provides security. And so if we were ready to go ahead with some water infrastructure, that actually the situation is quite good for that. Although I have to say, managing water infrastructure, again, I'm absolutely no expert, but even an idiot like me can see that water flows across boundaries, right? Water flows across provinces, across countries. And so you need national level, you need international level planning, because otherwise you might have a mess. And we've seen in the past how, especially Iran, but maybe also Pakistan, could have some really serious concerns about, making sure that water continues to flow in those rivers into their countries. And so that's, it's a potential flashpoint for conflict as well. Anyways, thank you so much for letting me into the space, and I really look forward to listening and learning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Graeme. Graeme, I've got a whole list of questions for you, especially since you brought up the Kush-Tepe Canal, which is making some progress. But so there's a solution section to the agenda. So I'd like to save those questions for then. And related to something you mentioned about vulnerabilities, Afghanistan and its vulnerabilities, I'd like to request our speaker Najibullah to provide us some perspective on why Afghanistan is so vulnerable to climate change. Najibullah, you're on mute. If you can unmute yourself and answer that question, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Hamidi Saib. I hope you hear me now. Exactly. Why Afghanistan is vulnerable to climate shocks. Basically, vulnerabilities maybe can be well defined as a function of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity if we look at it at these aspects. If you look at the exposure, Afghanistan is very exposed to basically droughts and flash floods. We see that recently the frequency and intensity of droughts have increased, and also some rapid rains occur that basically in a time that it's not expected. For example, this year we see that during monsoon, where in Afghanistan, in major provinces of Afghanistan, it was basically harvest time, and then the heavy rain came, and basically took the people by surprise, and we have seen that many regions basically lost harvest. And that somehow is due to the geography that Afghanistan is having, because Afghan people, they are living scattered on small valleys, and in small valleys when you have very rapid rain, basically that generates in very short time a very large peak. In compared to large watershed areas, small watersheds, they are really in a very rapid time, in very short time, the flow is peaking, and basically it gives you no time to escape or to a safer place. So this is very limited to those areas where the steep valleys are existing. Yes, the second thing that why Afghanistan is basically very exposed and vulnerable to climate shocks is basically underdeveloped infrastructure. We have some dams and reservoirs which are built in 60 and to 80s. But after 80s, we have, except Salma Dam, which is recently built, and Kamal Kham, which is also not storing water but regulating, we have very limited storage capacity. If I tell some examples here, for example, total storage capacity of Afghanistan is 2 cubic kilometer. In compare to our neighbors, for example, Iran has 44 cube kilometer storage, and Pakistan 27 cubic kilometer. So it's a large difference if we compare to other neighboring countries. So the other thing is in terms of sensitivity, because most of Afghans basically relying on agriculture. Their main income is from agriculture, and of course, agriculture is the sector which is highly impacted by climate change and climate shocks. And if the agriculture is impacted, of course, the people have no other income source. So basically, a large part of population is basically losing their main source of income. So in the country, there is no alternative. If we compare, for example, there no very limited vertical agriculture, for example, or other source of income. So the other thing is when a climate shock happens, how the community basically reacts after the climate shock. When a flood happens or a drought comes, is there ability of the community to react? In Afghanistan, unfortunately, when a drought happens, okay, people cannot do anything against it, and they are usually the land which is cultivated. For example, last year in North Afghanistan, the cultivated land and wheat, which was waiting for spring rainfalls, that did not happen, and the wheat, basically the cultivated land, dried and failed to produce harvest. And of course, when a flood happens, after flood, there's a huge problem of reacting, basically the ability to implement effective adaptation strategies, and after to learn how to basically from this flood to avoid repetition of such events in the future. This ability is not present in Afghanistan due to the several reasons, due to low human capacity and awareness. Of course, awareness is adding to this problem, because people think, okay, this happened, and this might have happened also in the past, and we cannot do anything about it. And this low awareness basically is exposing people to such a climate shocks also in the future.
Thank you, Najibullah. Najibullah, so if I could just summarize what you said in a sentence, in a couple of sentences. Essentially, what you said was that there's still enough water, but where the infrastructure technology is not there to efficiently use it or preserve the water. So therefore, you have intermittent water when there's river water and it peaks. It's all great, but then during the summer times when it dries up, there's not enough water, and then the crops dry out. So unlike other countries that do have technology which can harness and create water reserves, Afghanistan has little of that. Is that accurate?
Exactly. I mean, we have to look at it from the water user perspective and also from the what's available. I mean, what is available has high seasonality. I mean, in the time that we need water, we need water. There is no water in the high summer, and at the time that the water demand for water is very low, we have water, and because we don't have infrastructure to store that water for the demand time, basically this infrastructure is very old. And I mean, the infrastructure, the reservoirs that we have, due to this high sedimentation, for example, if we give an example of Kajaki in the southwest, which is the largest reservoir there, it has lost more than 35% due to sedimentation, the storage capacity. So on the other hand, the water user, as other speaker also said, that we have low efficiency in irrigation efficiency. We are using still the old fashioned furrow irrigation, which has like a 25% efficiency, lower than 25% efficiency. So there is large capacity to improve in terms of irrigation and cropping. Even the cropping is also a main problem in Afghanistan, because people are used to only one type of cropping, that it's wheat, maize, or maybe some vegetables. But there are a lot of other crops that can be grown and can basically generate income with
Understood.
basically low water.
Understood. So efficiency is an issue, water storage is an issue, and of course, most importantly, now we also have low levels of water, right? I'm sure many of us who have relatives in Afghanistan have a house in Afghanistan, and over the past 15 years, we've had to dig. Running water is we take running water for granted, but in Afghanistan, everybody has wells in their house. And we had to dig the well 3 or 4 times to depths of even 60 meters, and we still were not able to get water. And that led us to actually, the community, the town decided to pool money together and basically dig a deep well of like 80 meters or 100 meters down, which is now serving the community, but then you have to go get the water. It's just a major problem. Something that we typically take for granted is becoming a major issue for a lot of Afghans in Afghanistan. Now, related to that, Najib John, if you can also give us some information on water levels, right? The scarcity of water levels, and of course, the impact of climate change on water availability, glacier shrinkage. I didn't even know we had glaciers, but you'd mentioned that we have glaciers. If you can provide us quickly some information on that, I'd appreciate it.
Exactly. Climate change basically impacts the way the rainfall or precipitation as a general term occurs. In Afghanistan, basically, we don't, I mean, if you look at the longer trend of the precipitation, it has not changed a lot. But what has changed is that rapid precipitation and very intense and localized precipitation increased, and very steady and slow precipitation, which are very effective in groundwater recharge for crops, and also they are not harming anyone in terms of floods. They are becoming they are decreasing. I mean, the events of such a precipitation. So in terms of precipitation, this change has occurred. And the other issue is basically that due to the air temperature, more air temperature, of course, we have snow melt, which occurs about 20 to 30 days earlier than before. So that happens when we have spring rainfalls, because spring rainfall is already enough for crops in most of the regions, and that snow melt basically leaves our country without being used because, again, due to the poor infrastructure. And of course, the snow melt has the snow, have a large impact on Afghanistan water resources, because snow on the Hindu Kush mountains basically serves as a natural reserves of water for high demand time, which is summer. if we give an example how this basically this changes has impacts on the surface waters. If you look at the Kabul River, for example, Kabul River has 3 times more drier time now than before 1980s. If you look at the data, hydrological data from 1960 to 1980s. And another example, maybe Lugar River has 8 times more dry time than before. So it's immense, and this has consequences, of course, for the people, because surface water is the easiest way to be used for the locals. You don't need anything for that, and Afghans know how to use surface water and from the rivers. But that seasonality really basically puts a lot of pressure, and that has happened in the past, and we know that slowly people are basically turning to groundwater, and we know that our groundwaters in the last decade or so is exhausting in southwest of the country, 3 to 4 meters per year, and in Kabul we know the situation is already dire. From 1 to 2 meters per year, the groundwater levels are declining, and this is really tense situation. I think if you look at the economy of Afghanistan, maybe in the future, mining sector will play an important role in Afghan economy. And we see that if we have already struggling with our water shortage, for mining sector, of course, we need also water. For example, for copper mine, for 1 ton processing of copper mine, you need between 80 to 350 cubic meter water. So that's also a thing, an important source, I think, an important issue that should be discussed.
Thank you, Najib John. I think there's so much more to discuss, and we're just tapping the surface of these issues. I hope we can have a more detailed discussion. I'd like to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Moyar, who is also a climate change expert. And related to what you said, Najib John, I want to ask Dr. Moyar, in the past 20 years, Dr. Moyar, how much was done from an infrastructure perspective, and where are we now? And then obviously I'll ask you what needs to be done next. But if you can give us an understanding of that, as well as the impact, and a second question is the impact of climate change on droughts. But we kind of answered that to some degree. But let's start off with the what was done from an infrastructure in the past 20 years. Dr. Assem, you're on mute, so if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's my pleasure talking to you, and also this list of very honorable people. Actually, I think it was better that we tackle the second question first, because it was the impact and the continuation of what our friend Najib has discussed. But by the way, I will come up to that one as well, because just as a brief recover of what Najib said, and also in addition to that one, I would like to add that Afghanistan is vulnerable because it doesn't have enough tools to tackle this problem. For example, if you put something on fire, it burns everywhere and it affects everything that is every component of that item. So similarly, the global warming is affecting Afghanistan from all directions, and some of these directions are very vulnerable to this global warming. For example, the agriculture, because the main reason is that Afghanistan does not have sufficient infrastructure. The infrastructure which was built in 1960s, on that time the population was 9 to 10 million in Afghanistan. Now the population has grown to 35 million, and that infrastructure is not enough to answer or to fulfill the demand of these people. That's why most of the people now suffer the shocks, and they are suffering from climate change events. One other thing that why agriculture in Afghanistan is very vulnerable is the reason is that most of the Afghan agriculture is rain-fed agriculture. If I give you some statistics that the whole Afghanistan arable land is the potential arable land about is in Afghanistan about 7 million hectare. That was designed or planned during the Dawood Khan regime. But so far, what is cultivating is half of that, 3.5 million hectare. And this amount of the area is cultivated partially because of lack of infrastructure and water resource management. So what has been irrigated is half of that the 3.5. It's 1.7 million hectares. For example, in a clear, I would tell you 1/4 of the potential arable land is irrigated, and the left, the other arable land is depending on the rainfall, and that's why the climate change is directly affecting that agriculture. So the best way to tackle the climate change is to change the agriculture into arable or irrigated agriculture rather than the rainfed. In that case, one should restore water and manage water in the reservoirs, then use that water in an appropriate time or when it is needed. So this way, the drought or the climate change effects could be somehow reduced. Another one, the main problem is the temporal distribution of water or the precipitation in Afghanistan. For example, if you look, the main precipitation or the wet season of Afghanistan is the winter season or somehow spring. It's mostly starts in November or to the end of May. So this time the precipitation occurs, which is now also affected by the global warming, and that's changed from snow to rainfall. And if a rainfall occur in the 2 weeks, water drain out of the country. There are maps designed and that determine the amount of day that on which the water is going out of the country, and that's why in the following months Afghanistan lacks water. So that was some issues that's missing, and I will come up to what has been done. Is that okay? Regarding the climate change, the Republic did some progress and did some works, but that was also not enough. What was done, I can divide it into two categories. First, it was to develop some institutions. For example, the NEPA or the National Environmental Protection Agency, and in that organization, then later the Directorate of the Climate Change was established, and following that was the focal point of the climate change, according to the other funding donors. In addition to that, there was some other legalization like legals, the environmental law, the strategies, policies, further reports. For example, every party, like in the COP that Michael already mentioned, the countries should report to them and should provide the basic information that's required for funding. So far, Afghanistan had submitted two national communication or the reports of representing the status of the country, and it was planned to submit the third one, but now the government has collapsed, and no one will fulfill this gap, and that's also one problem that I have discussed, and this should be addressed, because if someone not look into this ground and do not submit the communication report to the UNFCCC, then it would be a clear gap, and it will affect the further works. On the other side, the government was trying to fund or to find financial support for climate change from the abroad or from the outside foreigner funds. Because if you see, climate change is an external problem to the country. Afghanistan is not producing greenhouse gases. Afghanistan produces 0.3% of the global emission. Yeah, and that's why Afghanistan or the Afghan people is not responsible for the global warming, but they are the victim of the global warming, and they are in the 6th position most vulnerable nations in the world. Looking to this fact, the government relate that the funding should be from the external organizations, and that's why they were trying to submit proposals with coordination of the third party. But there was also a problem of lack of capacity of these institutions to submit the required proposals and bring the budget or the funds to tackle the effect of the climate change, or at least reach the most vulnerable people or the affected people. Considering this one, the third-party organization, for example, the UNFO, UNDP, and WFP, World Bank, these organizations were supporting the government, and they were collaborating to develop or design projects. And one of the component of these projects was the capacity building of the government, because these projects aimed, or there were also some specific projects to support the government, or to stable, to reach the government employees reach in a position that they themselves can apply for these grants and tackle the climate change in the future by themselves. However, they had some progress, but it was not achieved. And yeah, looking to this progress, the Afghanistan government, also NEPA, on behalf of the Afghan government, submitted a report which is called Nationally Determined Contribution to the UNFCCC, or the United Nations Climate Change Convention, which is receiving regular reports. And in that one, the Afghan government requested 1 billion, or in total 10 billion, from 2021 to 2030 to tackle the climate change. This was amount of 1 billion per year for the 10 years. So most of these monies, as Afghanistan is affected country, not a greenhouse gas emitting country, most of these funds were devoted for the expanding agriculture or for the adaptation works rather than the mitigation. However, the government do not reach this level. So far we have learned from the NEPA and so on. There were some progress. Projects were ongoing with the collaboration to the NEPA, UNEP, Adaptation Fund, and also others that collectively, about when the government republic collapsed, there was collectively an $895 million project that were halted in one night. This amount of, yes.
Go ahead. No, finish your thought, and then I'll ask you a question. We do have our next speaker who has a hard stop at 1 o'clock, so I want to make sure we get to her, Wahzma John. So if you can finish your thought, I have a question, then we'll go to our next speaker.
Okay, I will just briefly mention that. Yeah. Yeah.
So, Mayar, if I may, one of the questions that comes to mind is that, is it really that difficult to create water reserves or to be able to store water in Afghanistan? Because we seem to have this challenge for ongoing for some time.
It's not a problem, but there is some legalization. For example, there's one another barrier for the climate change fund was that this fund were considered as a development aid, not as a loss and damage as recently categorized. And for the reservoir, it's infrastructure. So small reservoir cannot manage a sufficient amount of water that could be used. So it's a big infrastructure. There is the capacity, but there were lack of money. And another problem was that the donor, day by day, the legalization process is getting complicated, and the donors do not invest money on the projects that has not been legally solved or with the neighboring countries. For example, the neighboring countries has comment on dam construction on the Kona River. However, it's not affecting them, but there at least first there should be an agreement with the neighboring countries on this. So there are some barriers when that led to this circumstance, and however, it's possible to be tackled and solved this issue.
Thank you, Assem. Assem, I want to come back to you regarding but in the meantime, our next speaker has a hard stop at 1 o'clock, so I want to hand it over to my colleague Michelle, who will ask her a few questions. Thank you so much. Stay with us, Mayar Saib. We'll start Q&A or the solution section right after Wahzma John speaks.
Great. So we're going to go to Wahzma Frogh next. We discussed climate change policies and some of the problems that Afghanistan faces. Frogh Saib, if I would like to give you the mic, if you can give us some of your insights on the ground realities, the effects of climate change, and your input. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle John, and it's a great privilege to be among all the amazing experts here. I'm not an expert on climate change at all, but what I've seen on the ground in terms of the impact, as I work with a group of around 300 women in different parts of Afghanistan. And while a lot of conversations on climate change happens at a very kind of ghetto and bubbles, but on the ground you see that people have actually started seeing the impact on their lives. For example, the water issue was raised, but at the same time, like snow, for example. I was talking with my uncle last night, and Balkhan, he was saying about how, like, why it hasn't snowed much even last year and similarly this year. So on the ground, as you see, the situation of it is a crisis, to be very honest. It is a climate change crisis in Afghanistan, particularly following the drought of 2018, and then even 2021, or the droughts that happened, and then you saw, like, for example, the floods that took over like literally 2/3 of Afghanistan, and at the same time, like some 60 provinces actually were flooded in 2021, and early during the spring summer. And then at the same time, the impact on the communities is very much visible, like, of course, water, access to clean water, how the waters have turned mixed up with with muds, and at the same time the access to clean sanitation is another major challenge for communities. And we have seen how women and children are like kind of the first people who get the brunt. For example, like, I have seen so many reports of young little children, young girls who have been forced married by the farmer father, because what happened is that the father took debt and for his crops, and the crop all kind of damaged in the flood, or it was all rain fed one, there wasn't any rain, and the father had no kind of income to actually repay the debt, and then he had to marry off like little children as 3 and 4, and even that continues to happen in many parts of the country. The the malnutrition in children right now, 6 million women and children, actually like 5 million children, and are like at severe risk of malnutrition, and this is because the households do not have enough food. And even as we see the number of communities, the number of hungry stomachs continue to increase, because people ability to grow food has actually continuously diminished in many parts of the country. So on the ground, in the earthquake, for example, last year, like this year that we saw in Paktika, the Lower Paktia region, for example. And I was talking to, another woman in Kandahar who was talking about how much, Dahla reservoir has also kind of lost its water. And they are wondering that how the pomegranates this year would be, watered. And same goes to Kajaki, for example, how the water levels have come down. So the impact is very much severe on communities and on individuals. Another impact is also conflict. What I've also seen on the ground is that lack of these natural resources and water, for example, have become a source of conflict. Right now, for example, say a huge conflict is going on in Takhar, for example, between different community members. Same goes to Wardak, for example. between different ethnic groups. So this has, and people who migrate, for example, internally displaced from communities where they do not have any more, their lands are destroyed, or their livestock have been destroyed, and they come and take actually up space in another community. So it also has become a driver of conflict. And as you guys will be talking about the solutions, I think what I would suggest here is that um, as also somebody mentioned, like the world cannot continue sending, these sacks of flour and cans of oil to Afghanistan. So I really hope that we could continue advocating for actually like sustainable alternatives. And sustainable alternatives, yes, if it's not possible at times, or to engage with the current, while many people have different perspective on that, but maybe include Afghan experts and Afghan organizations who are working on the ground, to bring them. I very much hope that we would have more Afghans at COP27 who could bring our perspectives there. And at the same time, donors and UN agencies, they need to be actually, pressured to invest in these sustainable alternatives. And they could be actually local as well. For example, like, some of the very basic small scale adaptations, locally. How do people who used to grow, for example, wheat, and cannot grow wheat anymore, what could be some of those, like sprinkling water solutions, some of those, for example, other crops that they could actually start growing. So some of these locally small scale adaptations can actually happen. And I would also talk about the deforestation, because of the winter, cold winters in Afghanistan, and people are not able to have winter heating kind of resources. So they actually cut the trees. They cut the trees to use for the firewood, and that has actually resulted in the loss of literally more than 60-70% of the Afghan forests. And that reforestation could actually be something that could be worked on in terms of adding to the obstacles for example, for floods as well. So I think, and I don't think much had been happened in the past 20 years very much around the climate change response, because like 50% of the republic budget went to the war. So now, but then now that the war has kind of gotten over, then that money disappeared. So like now we need to continue asking for not just the damage loss funding for Afghanistan, but also that Afghanistan is being punished for not producing emissions. Afghanistan, US produces 50, is like responsible for 15%, and Afghanistan is responsible for 0.2. And still Afghanistan is not receiving some 4 or 5 billion a year for to pay for its development budget. So I think we need to also kind of look at how we are advocating for the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Wahzma. I think you really helped paint a very clear picture of some of the ground realities, and provided some great solutions. Do you know how people can help some of the local efforts? You discussed some solutions as far as advocacy, but maybe for more of the local efforts?
Yes. I know many organizations who are active in the country, including some international organizations who are working on the ground. For example, Afghan has been one of the organizations that works with communities reserving water reservoirs, for example, working with the communities in terms of having kitchen gardens. For example, women have been growing crops. There are cooperative, associations, the farmers association. So I think it's important to identify these organizations on the ground, and a lot of other Afghan organizations. Right now, for example, the women I work with continue asking for support in terms of livestock, because livestock have been very much kind of they have lost it. Women that we just had our distribution in Guyane for a district in Paktika, for example, and the women were saying, could you help us with livestock? Can you help me, like, for example, buy a cow so that I can actually get the milk for children and at the same time can sell it. So people know how to cope with it. I think people have great knowledge of how they can develop their own coping mechanisms very locally, but they need the support. So these cooperatives on the ground, there are farmers associations, there are these international organizations on the ground, the UN agencies that way they could actually receive the funding at this point. Because what I am also hearing is this excuse that, because there is of course the sanctions on the Taliban government or emirate, but then at the same time it's also the challenge of capacity. So yes, we cannot start building dams at this point, but maybe we can actually help this community in Bala Murghab, for example, who just lost the whole some of their reservoirs that they had built locally. So maybe that could actually happen. So those locally small scale efforts and adaptations can actually happen.
Thank you very much. I think it's very important to hear the voices on the ground. As you said, they are closest to the issues and definitely can see the solutions forward. We just have to highlight those voices. Thank you so much, Frogh Saib. I'm going to go.
Thank you, and I'm sorry that I have to leave. I had agreed to this earlier, so I will.
No problem.
Thank
you so much for participating. We were happy to have you here. Thank you. I'm going to give the mic back to Hamidi Saib, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle. So related to the points that Wahzma mentioned on the realities on the ground and what's happening, I would like to hear from our next speaker, Nasratullah Mateen, who's the founder and CEO of Earth the Lost Heaven. ELH is a environmental NGO based in Kabul and have presence in all of the provinces in Afghanistan. So, Nasratullah Jan, I would like to ask you, I've got a few questions, but to begin with, how much awareness and education is there amongst Afghans about climate change? Is there anything in the educational curriculum that people where awareness is being raised, and then additionally, what are you guys doing to tackle? What issues are you guys tackling currently, and what do you envision doing in the future? Nasratullah Jan, you're on mute, so if you can unmute yourself and answer those questions, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Tawajab. Tawajab, am I audible?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone, wherever you are in the world. It's such a pleasure today to be speaking on behalf of Earth, the Lost Heaven, representing perspectives of local grassroots and movements. Well, regarding the level of awareness and education of average Afghans about climate change, I would like to say that unfortunately the level is extremely low. Forget about climate change, even for environmental protection, the level of awareness is low. And it was very low, but in recent years, it has improved greatly, thanks to grassroots initiatives like ELH and many others that are in Afghanistan, and the increasing number of environmental networks and activists in Afghanistan. But regarding climate change, it's still very low. Years of conflict and lack of investment in community-based solutions have left people behind, and most irresponsible actions toward the environment are also due to poverty and displacement. However, the average Afghan knows almost nothing about climate change. They do not realize the connection between climate change impacts and the disasters which are happening, like drought, flash floods, and others that the distinguished speakers mentioned before. For example, an average citizen and also the farmers, they have just noticed the change in the weather patterns and also the increase in extreme events, but they do not know it's because of climate change. And when it comes to a school curriculum, there is no specific subject which focuses on environmental protection or climate change in school in Afghanistan. Only in the higher education section, the past government's Ministry of Higher Education managed to prepare a team and include a mandatory subject of environmental protection in all universities to be taught in 1 or 2 semesters. And this was about to be implemented nationally. But so far, I don't have any updates whether this program has initiated or not because the government collapsed. And for years, the impact of climate crisis was never taken into consideration with the development. Despite the environmentalists speaking out on certain projects on their unsustainability and also their harm to the long-term benefits. Now, there are many challenges right now or issues that ELH is trying to tackle. The first one is raising awareness because it's really low. And when it comes to raising awareness, we should learn from the past in order to make better decisions, especially when it comes to climate change adaptation and mitigation, because as a country that relies on revenues now while being under sanctions, Afghanistan cannot afford to continue just cleaning up and recovering after climate disasters, when instead we could just invest in preventive measures or the adaptation to reduce the effects of climate disasters. So in this case, we must ask ourselves what has and what hasn't worked in the last 2 decades or more. And we are also trying to tackle the next challenge, which is the cycle of short-term profit-taking precedence over long-term benefits of conserving the environment that provides for the country's economy, which is a serious issue, and it has been in the development work that has been carried out in the past 2 decades. For years, people assumed progress in any development work without considering environmental sustainability or why we need to revolve the development around the climate crisis. And also, we have a language barrier because we know Afghanistan is a country that is diverse in culture and in languages. We have bridges to gap in order to ensure the sustainability of the solutions that are implemented, and language is one of them. Because just people not knowing or speaking Pashto and Dari doesn't mean they should remain unaware of what is happening, specifically when it comes to climate change and the solutions that we want to implement or the other organizations. Another issue that we're working for is the skill building with our youth to utilize their knowledge in the best way for problem solving, for critical thinking, and also for being creative and resourceful. We want to empower the people to sustain the solutions that we implement and help them know why we are implementing certain solutions. At the same time, we have tried our best to work with the appropriate ministries and stakeholders to implement policies for sustainable practices that the economy needs for a very long time, which includes the mining sector, energy sector, and tourism. So these are just the efforts that we have been doing, but are at a very small scale, and it needs to be scaled up. And what we have done so far, all has been focused on the overarching theme of the initiative, which is to work with one another, to work with neighboring countries, to invest in not only a stable and sustainable Afghanistan, but also the region, because the challenge we are talking about climate change, it is not a national one, it's an international one, and it doesn't know any borders. So far, we have been working for raising awareness through environmental trainings in schools for teenagers, webinars, city-level campaigns, speaking on national and international media outlets, tree plantation campaigns, both independently and also with other government organizations. Another unique thing that we have at ELH is the women's group, where we focus to work with other women in the community on climate solutions. And recently we recruited and we are recruiting diaspora as members to contribute to climate action, which includes the public health experts or veterinary experts as potential partners to help consult on projects or implement the projects that we are aiming for. All I'm mentioning is like things ELH has been doing, but this needs to scale up because it needs to scale up, and the problem is bigger we can imagine. And also we have partnered with other NGOs and groups such as Smile Givers for community-based campaigns or to consult in the activities. We also have been working with Sophia Foundation in terms of sustainable development, and also to implement sustainable solutions that would contribute to development and also help the communities to adapt to climate change. And at the same time, we have been networking with fellow climate activists in neighboring countries in order to engage in productive dialogue and also to partner with them in initiatives that Afghanistan and the specific neighbors can invest. For example, last winter we had a webinar with Wadi Iran, which is an organization in Iran, about air pollution in Kabul and Tehran. So these are the things ELH has been tackling, and we have been doing, and but it needs to scale up. Really, the grassroots movements, the environmental organizations, their activities needs to scale up in order to have lasting change.
Thank you, Nasser John. I mean, you kind of answered my second question as well as to what you guys are doing and what should be done. So, and the list of issues plaguing Afghanistan are long. I mean, we haven't even touched the surface of many of these issues, from air pollution to deforestation, forest fires, droughts, flooding, soil degradation, water shortages, diminishing water, ground and river water, increased and erratic temperatures. And to your point, tackling these issues really require funding and the international community engagement. It cannot be solved at a local level, and that therein lies the challenge. With that said, I'd like to move on to potential solutions, and I'd like to pose this question to Michael and Graeme. I'd like to get their perspectives, both of their perspectives, on what can be done from the international community and regional engagement collaboration on climate change with Afghanistan. And how can the international community really work with Afghanistan, given its current political dynamics, to ensure that at least on the area of climate change, there is collaboration and work. If I can, Michael, if you'd like to start off first, and then we'll hear from Graeme.
Yeah, thanks. And I should say I really enjoyed listening and learning from these previous presentations. And I would give a caveat that others have, and I think it's important that, especially that I give this caveat, that I'm not an expert on climate change either, and I look at it through the lens of Afghanistan and the broader region that I study. So that said, yeah, I think we need to acknowledge that it's going to be very difficult for Afghanistan to take forward these discussions about climate change on formal levels on the world stage, given its current political situation, so long as the Taliban is in power. And I think we can agree it's going to be in power for quite some time. But sort of setting that aside for a second, I think that the regional dimension is really important here. There's some pretty ineffective regional organizations that, in different circumstances, could speak together about climate change, cooperation and countering climate change. I mean, SARC, as we all know, is a mess of a regional organization because of the India-Pakistan problem. And decisions are based on unanimity. When you have two members that don't agree on much, you're not going to get very far. But there have been some statements put out by SARC in the past about the need to move forward on climate change related issues. But sort of setting SARC aside, looking at some of the other organizations, the regional groups and multilateral groups that Afghanistan has been a member of up to this point, looking at what prospects there could be for focusing on climate change mitigation within those groups, and whether you're talking about the Heart of Asia, Istanbul group, the SCO, there are various options that one could look at. To be honest, I don't think that climate change is a priority issue there, so it would need a lot more work. But I do think that the regional bent is an important one to look at. But beyond that, there have been plenty of important, impactful discussions about how to get more assistance to Afghans that allows the international community, and particularly the West, to avoid the sanctions problem. I don't see why one couldn't fit in discussions about climate mitigation into those discussions. Something simple like providing assistance for climate resistant building supplies to make homes more climate proof, that type of thing. There's no reason why that should necessarily be caught up in all the problematic discussions about sanctions. I guess whenever it comes to providing any type of assistance to Afghanistan these days, that's always going to be a risk. But my point is that you're hearing more conversations about expanding the scope of assistance that can be provided to Afghanistan in ways that don't run afoul of sanctions. There's no reason why one cannot and should not include discussions about mitigation, adaptation related assistance, climate mitigation, adaptation related assistance in that context.
Thank you, Michael. And to, I guess, on a related note, if it's not tackled, the effects of what happens in Afghanistan will also impact the regional neighbors. That could mean more, displaced people, refugees, and more. So it really is a regional issue or an international issue versus it being isolated to Afghanistan. Yes, Afghans will be affected more, but that is the other side of it. Graeme, if we can hear your perspective on how we can, or how the international community can better engage on and tackle these issues.
Yeah, and I think you're right. The regional dimension is very important because the regional countries can't afford to just ignore Afghanistan. Exactly as you say, if the surface of Afghanistan is not inhabitable, that becomes a problem for the neighbors. And I think that's part of why you're seeing a much more pragmatic kind of engagement from regional countries as opposed to Western countries. Because if you are a donor like Canada or Australia, you can afford to issue press releases about the situation of women in Afghanistan and just like not engage on some of the really hard work that needs to be done to stabilize the country. Whereas if you are a neighbor, like Uzbekistan or Pakistan, you basically have no choice. I mean, the Taliban are your neighbors, and you have to roll up your sleeves and get involved in fixing these things. I was typing notes as our colleagues were talking. I thought it was stunning what Najibullah Said said about Afghanistan having only 2 cubic kilometers of water storage capacity as opposed to dramatically more next door in Iran and Pakistan. I thought Assem Mayar's comments about only 1/4 of the arable land in Afghanistan being irrigated is it's terrible. And so in terms of solutions, yes, local level adaptation strategy is great, but that is just not going to cut it when you're talking about large scale problems. So in Istanbul in September, there started to be a lot of discussion about large scale infrastructure solutions. Major donors got nervous. They said, whoa, we might consider small scale infrastructure, but we can't be thinking about large scale engagement while the Taliban, remain unrecognized and remain uncooperative on a number of other fronts. And so unfortunately, it is still sort of hung up at this political level. There can't even be, there is no national development plan in Afghanistan, right? Normally, a poor country would have a development plan. Climate change would be part of that. You'd have some sort of a written policy for how the country is going to move forward economically. And there just is none of that right now because it is impossible for the World Bank and other, development actors to hold high-level meetings with Taliban ministers and say, okay, what do you want? What do we want? How are we going to make this work? Just that basic kind of dialogue is really stunted by the toxic politics right now. All 3 of the major climate financing mechanisms have been on hold since the Taliban takeover of August 2021. It was difficult for NEPA to even get its emails answered. So there does have to be a more pragmatic approach, I think. And it's not really, it is also a principled approach. The principled approach is that, the men and the women in Afghanistan need to survive. So the principle is putting human life first. So yeah, I mean, I think other, IDA funds, obviously, right? I mean, some of that could flow to water management projects. But these are above all political challenges, and ultimately not technical at the moment. Thanks.
Thank you, Graeme. I'm not sure if you're aware of anything that's actually being done at an international level to address this. We know that COP27 recently happened, and Afghanistan wasn't even invited to be a participant. So, is anybody other than us here? Is anybody addressing this at all, or even looking into this?
Yeah,
That's
so
both for you or Michael. Go ahead.
I mean, for example, there had been hope of taking some ideas to the World Bank board at the middle of this month. I think that meeting was scheduled for the 15th of December. And then, the Taliban started rolling out further restrictions on the freedoms of women and girls. And so you get this onslaught of negative headlines. And I'm now skeptical that that conversation is even going to happen at the World Bank this month. It just makes the politics extremely tough for anyone advocating, that we should finish the job of economic stabilization and, move ahead with climate adaptation in Afghanistan. That you're talking about trying to get big budgets out of, reluctant donors that are already stretched in all kinds of other different directions internationally. There's lots of other things on the global agenda. It makes Afghanistan a tough sell. And it shouldn't. I mean, obviously, making sure that Afghanistan can support human life is, should be a priority. But those are the political realities, I think.
Thank you, Graeme. So fortunately, we have Piotr with us, Piotr Kurzin, who actually works at the World Bank on climate security, and he has had done some work on Afghanistan. So Piotr, if you can provide some information as to what the World Bank might be doing or willing to do on Afghanistan, I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tawab. It's been a really fascinating conversation, and I really appreciate ASEF to include me amongst some of these amazing speakers. I recognise some familiar faces. Yeah, I think probably to Graeme's point, the World Bank expanded what was known as Approach 2.0 in March of this year. The approach was to guide the provision of more than about $1 billion in funds from what's known as the ARTF. But as Graeme pointed out, this has since been delayed, and there's been some, should we say, revisits to how this is going to be done, because of the continued reduction and encroachment on women's rights. The Taliban said that they wouldn't reinforce some of the laws that they'd had when they previously governed, and have since reneged on those commitments. There was one specific project called the Afghanistan Emergency Food Security Project, which is the acronym I mentioned, with the idea that would focus on wheat production, supporting about 300,000 households in the November 22 planting season, and then another 300,000 in sort of the March to November 23 planting season. The goal was also to improve, obviously, the role of women by training about 150,000 in cultivation and nutrition, and then to increase the linkages between farmers and women involved in gardening with, say, local markets, to facilitate the sale of surpluses of wheat, vegetables, and legumes. The project was also meant to increase access to irrigation, water, improve soil and water conservation, and build climate resilience. We've touched upon some of the speakers talking about adaptation, prevention, or in some cases resilience, and that was by supporting things like rehabilitation, improvement of specifically selected irrigation watershed management systems over around 40,000 hectares of land. The total amount would be about $195 million released into what's known as tranches. So first 150 and then followed by a further 45 million. And then there was another one which is known as the Afghanistan Community Resilience and Livelihoods Project. This project aims to provide livelihood and income opportunities for about 1 million households in just under 6,500 rural communities across sort of cities like Bamya, Herat, Kabul, Kandahar, Khost, and a few others. And this would be, in addition, about an estimated 9.3 million Afghans in the same areas would receive benefit from basic utilities, services, and clean water. There's quite a lot of detail here that I can share with anyone who's interested. The World Bank has each of these projects detailed or published in a bit more detail. They are ongoing, so obviously they're subject to change. But this leads me to a broader point that I just wanted to mention, which is that I focus primarily on the intersection of climate and security, and how, as we know, climate change is a threat multiplier. It exacerbates existing insecurities and risks across, fragile regions, be it, say, the Sahel, the North Horn of Africa, or even south in sort of Mozambique. We're seeing a rise of, the emergence sort of a branch of Islamic State. So Afghanistan is a typical example of this, and we have the US, which basically, with a group of other countries, tried to establish the fund. I forget the name of it. I think it was the Afghan Fund in Switzerland earlier this year, which would be about $3.5 billion worth to help tie over some of this humanitarian crises that are appearing within the country. Problem is, you've got to balance doing that without legitimizing the Taliban. So there remains, a fair amount of these funds inaccessible to the Taliban in, say, the US Federal Reserve. And the point is that if you don't do something to stem climate change, then that exacerbates the rise of potential allegiance to extremist groups. Obviously, the country's still very at risk from ISK and the Taliban more broadly in different regions. So the globe needs to shift their approach a little bit, I think, in how we look at climate change. The UN tried to pass a resolution last year, which was vetoed by Russia. But since, unilaterally, countries like the US have included climate change in their national security strategy published about 2 months ago. So clearly, this is something that when we're looking at helping to stabilize and improve the situation for Afghans, we should look at it through a security lens as well, not merely just about adaptation and alleviation. But I'll end there, and I can share any of the information with anyone who's interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Piotr. If you could share that with myself, I'd really appreciate it, and anybody else who asks for it. And you touch on a very important point on the security side. And to your point, actually, we put together a video specifically mentioning this, that how the current humanitarian situation can exacerbate to the point where we'll have a security element to it. And it's pinned in Asif homepage, the Twitter homepage. So I appreciate that feedback. A quick question, just and we only have about 30 seconds. The funds that you mentioned, what's the status of those funds right now? I think you said 195 million that the World Bank had allocated, or we're planning to allocate.
Yeah, so the 195 is, as I say, is split into two segments. Initially 150. I presume, I don't have the intricate details to hand, but I would presume that's because of, some degree of setup as well, versus the 45, which would be the second segment, and that would be simply, a greater implementation of the second phase of next year. As far as I can tell, those haven't been put forward yet into sort of an actual distribution phase. They remain. This is all a roadmap with planning in process. But again, I think there's a degree of caution about going ahead with it until there's a greater clarity of what the Taliban are doing vis-a-vis human rights and other issues that obviously the World Bank wants to remain committed to. So the latest update I can find just by Googling now was from early September. So I think you probably will have to wait a little bit longer, maybe early next year, to see any potential shift on that.
Thank you, Piotr. We're running out of time, so I want to make sure we get Q&A from other people. But I had two additional questions for Najibullah and Dr. Mayar. The first question was that if Afghanistan were to do one or two important things related to infrastructure that would have a domino effect where it would solve multiple issues, what would it be? And then I also want to understand the impact that Khoshtapa Canal can have on Afghanistan. So let me ask the first question to Najibullah, and then I can ask the Khoshtapa question to Dr. Mayar. Najibullah, if you can give us your perspective on that one or two things that needs to be done in Afghanistan that can have a domino effect from a solution perspective to tackle many other issues.
Exactly. I think Afghanistan can do two main things that are already discussed, I think. One is, of course, to invest on infrastructure. Infrastructure for basically reducing the climate change impacts is important. Infrastructure means that water storage infrastructure, dams, either small scale or large scale dams, but we know there are challenges for building such a large scale solutions. But the other thing that Afghanistan can do is basically is to really rethink the agriculture and irrigation practices in Afghanistan. That means that we have a large capacity to improve the water usage efficiency in Afghanistan in terms of irrigation. As I already mentioned, the irrigation system efficiency in Afghanistan is very low. We have large capacity to basically save a lot of water with the limited water that are available. Without infrastructure, of course, we can produce much more food and improve food security in the country. So with that, I mean to really think about the cropping, to think about different cropping, and to think about the new technologies in irrigation, drop irrigation, sprinkler, and so on and so forth. These two main areas, I think Afghanistan can do a lot, and of course for that we have to spread awareness among the farmers. Of course, that would be the job of the universities, the institutions, the grassroots initiatives to really, in a large scale, to spread awareness, information on new technologies, agriculture and irrigation technologies, and in general, climate change impacts awareness.
Thank you, Najib John. I mean, we've had this discussion before, and I couldn't agree with you more. And I do believe that I'm hoping that even the World Bank and other institutions can actually allocate or earmark money for these kind of projects, possibly a water reservoir. I want to go back to Piotr, but before I go to Piotr, Dr. Mayar, if you can give us some update on the Khoshtapa Canal. We know that the current Afghan de facto government has been investing heavily on this canal, and it has made decent progress thus far. If you can give us some update of what it could mean for Afghanistan and the current status, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I will come to that question just in a few seconds. First, I would discuss that climate change affects a lot of sectors, and it has effects from agriculture to forest fire and much things, and we cannot mention all of them here due to this time restriction. For example, this year, forest fires occurred due to lack of precipitation for a continued more than 3 weeks. I was following it when it happened in the Kunar province. So after that, when the rainfall happened, the forest fires decreased. So there are effects on other dimensions, for example, agriculture and so on. And recently, as Sadid mentioned, the water-saving technologies can boost the arable land or agricultural land in Afghanistan. I can give an example from Uzbekistan. There, the government is subsidizing utilization of the water-saving technologies to the farmers. For example, they are paying 50% of the cost to the farmers as a subsidy, and the farmers borrow 50% more, and then they use the water-saving technologies like pipe irrigation, drip irrigations, and other techniques and implement it. Because implementing or changing the irrigation regime has some cost, and this should be paid. On the other side, the government with some taxes for them. So this way they are saving water for the downstream areas. So Afghanistan can also design such a projects by the international donors, and then they can expand the irrigation area. One other small and brief important example I would mention that recently
Moyarsan,
yes.
sorry to cut you off. We do want to be cognizant of time because we kind of
Okay.
have already gone over. So
Yeah.
if you want to table the question of the Khoshtapat canal to somebody else, I'm more than happy. But I just want to be mindful of time.
Yeah. Khoshtapat canal is irrigating about 600,000 hectares land. And if we look at the previous statistics that I presented, this is about, I would say, half of the current or 1/3 of the current irrigable land that now is under water. So it would be, or it would create a large amount of opportunity for food security. But considering the population growth, this and also the Kamal Khan irrigation project is not enough for the food security of the country. So because drought is affecting a lot of agriculture, and that's why such a big projects would be an asset, but still they are not enough.
Thank you, Moyarsan. Piotr, I think you wanted to make a comment related to this topic, so feel free.
Thank you. It's just a quick public service announcement. In the pinned links above, because I don't just like to talk knowledge, I like to share some ideas or resources or reference tools. Above, I've shared 2 links to a couple of initiatives the World Bank have been doing, and I worked on. I didn't work directly on Afghanistan, but one of them is known as the Climate Change Knowledge Portal, or CCKP, and in that I've shared specifically the link to the Afghan country profile, and in that you see some of the key takeaways. I think there are a few policy recommendations or ideas, but also within it is referenced the second link to what's known as the climate screening tool, which is basically a method, a systematic sort of tool, which is basically looking at things like agriculture, water, roads, coastal flood protection, if that is obviously of relevancy, and then you can look at different ways to sort of recognize, identify, inform, learn, and flag, as the World Bank puts it. So a couple of resources there for people to take away if that's of use to them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Piotr. I appreciate it. So going back to the Khoshtapat Canal, because this is a major undertaking and it could be hopefully very useful for Afghan farmers. If Graeme or Najibullah wants to make a comment on that, feel free. I recall there were about 30 to 40% complete with it last time I heard. But if you guys have any updated information, I'd appreciate it.
I think,
and then we will go into Q&A.
If you just add a small comment on that, Khoshtapat is really a great opportunity, but Khoshtapat is also impacted by climate change. We know that Al Mudarya is catchment is basically fed from glaciers that no melt, and we know the glaciers are shrinking in a rapid pace there. The water allocation would be really a problem there. So the 600,000 hectare, which is now in the, is considered for the design, that would be, I doubt that that the water will be available throughout the year for this irrigation canal. But nonetheless, the project is really a hope for the whole North Afghanistan, from Balkh to Juzjan, basically to Faryab province. Is a hope, is creating a hope.
Thank you, Najib. Graeme, did you want to make a comment regarding the Khashaba Canal, or can we go to Q&A?
Maybe to just briefly say that some of the issues that we've been hearing regarding sediment accumulation, reducing the capacity of these irrigation systems and dams, and also what we've been hearing so far about how water tables are falling as people drill down to find water to water their crops. All of this really highlights the need for national level planning, which currently does not exist because of some of the political constraints that we've identified. So, it is fantastic to talk about local level adaptation and local level projects, but they all have to link together into something which they don't currently. So, thanks.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So with that said, we'll go to our first questionnaire. It is from Zamarai Baher. Zamarai said, if you can unmute yourself and pose your question, and within 30 to 45 seconds.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for such an informative discussion. As mentioned earlier in this space, Afghanistan doesn't have unfortunately, a formal wise international stages, and especially in climate change relevant summits. For example, despite Afghanistan is among 10 most impacted and vulnerable countries, but was not present in last COP summit, COP27. My question is that if the world continue their position of not recognizing current de facto government in Afghanistan, how Afghan people can attract or can use the loss and damage fund decided in COP27.
Zamarai said, who's the question for? Should we ask? I would say
whoever
let's
can,
ask Michael,
especially the people who are expert in finance issues.
Sure. I'm inclined to ask Michael that question. I'm not sure if you heard the question, Michael.
Yeah, thanks. I did. I'm certainly not a finance expert, but I would go back to something I said before, that we may be putting the cart before the horse and delving into the issue of this new loss and damage fund. There's an agreement to put one together, but there's a lot of work to be done before we get to that point. I mentioned the political factors that could make it difficult at this point in time, make it difficult for the donor states to agree to contribute to it until there are clear safeguards in place. So, I think that it's an achievement in of itself to actually get this agreement for the new loss and damage fund, especially given that it had never even been discussed on formal levels at a COP conference in the past. But as I understand it, and again, I'm not a finance expert or a climate change expert per se, we're talking about a baseline agreement here. I mean, this is basically a commitment. It's essentially reflecting a consensus within the participants of COP27 that it's a good idea to have this fund, and that there's agreement to have one. But in terms of specifics for what it's going to look like, how the funding channels will work, and the all-important issue of the safeguards to ensure that the money is used the way it should be. Long way to go until we get to that point. So I think that it's important to have additional conversations about climate financing outside of this specific conversation about this new fund, as important as it is. And I don't want to take away from how significant this agreement is, but a long ways away. I think it'll probably be a few more of these COP meetings before there's some more progress in what exactly is going to happen with it, until we have a sense as to how viable it is. So I don't want to sound like a Debbie Downer, but just trying to keep things realistic. That it's just a very modest start on that front.
Thank you, Michael. And that's such an important point because those who are working in the space might end up chasing a ghost when you should be focusing other avenues that could actually show results faster. With that said, I'd like to go next to Professor Nassim Mohammed. Professor Nassim, if you can unmute yourself and pose your questions and identify who you want to pose a question to, and keep it to within 45 seconds. I'd appreciate it. Thank
you. Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak. And I'm an academic, and I'm commuting between Abu Dhabi and Germany. I'm professor of climate change, ecosystems, functions, sustainability, and interactions. And I was, for a long time, I was interested to volunteer some time by taking some sabbatical leaves, but then the political landscape completely changed. So is there any opportunity in the universities, if I can teach maybe like on the campus or even in a remote way, a semester or half of the semester to engage with the students? Is there any opportunity on the ground these days? I'm just like to make a little bit.
Are you referring to Afghanistan?
Yeah, exactly. If it is possible to even go on the campus, I can take a sabbatical leave for half a semester, or for example, if there is an opportunity to teach them online, that's also possible to teach them one course. So is there any some academic activities going on the ground, or if it not in the near future, somebody can comment on this?
I'll just make a quick comment. From what I know and from what I've heard, there's absolutely an opportunity. No one would stop you. They're actually looking for individuals like you because there's such a huge shortage of professors and academics leaving out of the country. So I think it would be welcomed as far as I understand it. But it would just, I guess you'd have to reach out to the universities. We can have a follow-up discussion, and I'm sure some of the speakers can actually. Nasratullah is actually on the ground, so he can actually put you in touch with the right, either the private sector or the public sector, education sector. Nasratullah, if you want to answer that question, feel free.
Hi again. Yeah, for sure. As you mentioned, there's a high demand. And in Afghanistan, we have departments of environmental protection in many universities, but specifically in Central Kabul University, we have faculty of environment. And if he wants, I can somehow put him in contact with the professors there. And yeah, I'm sure they might have, they might welcome such kind of collaboration.
Thank you, Nasratullah. So please follow each other, and that would be a good way of following through on that. I'd like to go next to our next questionnaire, Mateen John Walizada. If you can unmute yourself, pose your question, and identify who you want to ask the question to. I'd appreciate it.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. So I exactly don't have any comment on the climate changes on Afghanistan, since the priority solution for the ongoing situation is, for me, is different bullet points. But for how we are aware of the situation, we need a solution for the ongoing situation in Afghanistan is a political solution. That's the first priority we have to discuss. But one thing and another comment on the Qushtepa Canal is, since I am a person who is coming from the north of Afghanistan, where this canal is establishing. There are the concerns of the people who has the property on the side of this canal, and being said that the canal gonna destroy their lands, their heritages, and many other historic places. And also, one another concerns from the people what we have been hearing that the land outside or around this canal going to be distributed for the people who are not locally from the area. So these are the points that people have been concerning. And also, we have the witness if that has been happening, and who knows that the land's gonna not be used for growing the narcotics and hashish or all those other elements that we have been suffering from those in other province of Afghanistan. So that was my point. If anyone has any comment on that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mateen Jan. Would anybody like to take that question? Najib Jan?
Just I don't want to, I don't know about the land distribution or any possible potential disputes there, or there is no concrete reason for that. I mean, until now, I haven't seen anything. But one thing about this heritage and the cultural heritage, I think I also mentioned it on my Twitter that there are some cultural sites that are basically the canal is crossing over it. Unfortunately, in the design and the feasibility study, this issue of cultural sites is really ignored somehow. And we see that in some sites, the canal is basically crossing over the very old cultural archaeological sites, which is really unfortunate. And I really pointed out this over social media to the authorities that they should readjust the route of the canal. But so far, I haven't really got any convincing answer for that.
Thank you, Najib Jan. I'd like to, I don't have anything else to add on that. I'm not sure if anybody else does, but there is a question from our audience. Let me just, she sent me a question. She said, can you ask how water reserves will work in central provinces such as Ghazni, Wardak, and Logar? The idea of green belt, digging small areas to reserve water. Najib Jan or Dr. Mayosab, if you can answer on that one.
Thank you very much. Actually, nowadays some small reservoirs are being built in these provinces. Honestly, the southern region receive less precipitation than the other higher mountains, but still this reservoir can play a crucial role in that region, and it can at least recharge the groundwater as well as store water for drinking purposes and livestock and so on. So these reservoirs are gradually increasing, and somehow it will be an asset for the next future. But further reservoirs or water regulation structure are needed across the country. There were talks about the small-scale projects, but if one would like to make an impact, the amount of small-scale projects should be considerable. So that should be that should cover a wide area to make a considerable impact on the social and economical life of the people around these projects. In contrast, I think there was no question, so I have another comment. Considering the effect of this year drought, recently there is a report that 35% of the wheat production has been reduced. And this 35%, if we look at the total wheat yield of the country, is about 4.5 million. while the requirement of the whole nation is 6 million ton. And so this 35% reduction or 30% reduction reduces 1.5 million ton of the wheat that's cultivated in the country. And therefore, during such drought years, Afghanistan need to import about 3 million ton of the wheat from the other countries. So if we estimate an economical value of this wheat, it's for example, 1 ton wheat costs about $250 without the delivery and transportation costs and so on. So the total amount of only wheat could be about 375 million US dollar only. However, the climate change or the drought affects proportional to this wheat the harvest, the livestock, and other sectors and other agricultural field as well. So considering or calculating this if amount of effect is very higher than those amount which is being paid for the climate change for currently. So if we look at the Afghanistan Special Trust Fund webpage, there has been the logo of a climate action, which means that they are tackling the climate change within the country under the humanitarian program. But if you look at the reality that they are not receiving funds from the or money from the climate change related funds or donors, for example, GCF, GAF, and so on. So the sanctions affected or were as a barrier to these projects, which has been halted, but new projects would be designed, and this takes time, as Piotr explained. So currently, it's a very urgent requirement, and I think if we can deliver the message, that would be that tackling the climate change as soon as possible, and with a considerable amount of financial support, not with smaller one. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Assem. So, on top of having these climate change issues, there's of course the bigger issue, even just as big an issue, is the funding, as well as once you have the funding, how do you operationalize the funding? Because the global community will not give money to the current de facto government. So then the issue is who's going to do it, right? And unfortunately, there aren't that many NGOs that I'm aware of when it comes to climate change that can undertake these massive initiatives. Because to tackle this, you really need to do it at a large scale level to make a dent, whether it's a water reservoir, dams, and there are multiple layers upon layers of challenges to get through to even once you have the funds to be able to actually do this. So I'll go on to the next speaker. Go ahead.
Can I just
Graeme.
make a quick two-finger intervention on that? If we succeed in Afghanistan at bringing economic stability, that is to say, bringing the GDP up to a point where humanitarian aid is no longer required, that implies expanding the GDP of the country. If you do that in any country, that means more tax and customs revenues for the people who run the country. And so this idea that you can help the people but not help the Taliban is just technically not correct. It is an impossible thing to do. And so it's a slogan that you often hear, used by the donors, and they say, oh, how can we, for example, build water infrastructure without helping the Taliban? And, I have to tell them, and I think an increasing number of voices are telling them, it is impossible. Benefits will flow to the people, benefits will flow to the Taliban. That's just, those are the laws of physics. I don't know what to tell you, So just, in terms of where we set the bar on what's achievable, I think it's important to keep that in mind. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Graeme. I echo that thought as well. I think there needs to be some level of collaboration with proper oversight to ensure that whatever is earmarked is used for that purpose. And I think that that could be a very workable solution in light of how desperate the country is and the fact that the government's fairly desperate as well. We'll move on to our last couple of questions because I want to end the space. We've already gone over. The next question is from Sadiq Sadiqi Wardak Saib. Wardak Saib, if you can open up your mic and pose your question, please keep it to 45 seconds.
Hello, everyone. I don't have really a question, but I am someone who was engaged in climate change adaptation in Afghanistan from 2015 to 2020. So if you like, I can give some information how the projects were being implemented that time and what were the plan that time and how we managed to get those projects implemented.
Siddiqui Saib, Wardak Saib, I'd love to hear on that, but we are short on time because we've gone over by 30 minutes. So if you have any, what we could do is possibly have another session on this because there's so much to tackle in the future, and I'd love to bring you in then. With that said, Dr. Zohra, are you able to hear us, and are you able to come up? In any case, Nasratullah, if you have a comment, feel free, and then we'll go to our next questionnaire, who is Suhail Stanigzai.
Thank you, Tawab. Yeah, I want one point which is very important I want to mention before we end the space is the importance of networking. There really needs to be networking between the grassroots organizations, the subject matter experts, the researchers, the international organizations to tackle this problem. And also, especially for the regional climate action, like right now, at TLH, we are trying to get involved with organizations in the neighboring countries to have action at regional level, because that way we can utilize the influence and experience to consult on projects in different sectors, create our own projects and work with multiple sectors, including the governments, through which we envision to have an expanded network of experts, both from Afghanistan, from neighboring countries, and international organization who will come on board and work on that. The issue of networking is really important. And lastly, the support of the local grassroots initiatives and organizations is very important, because these are the people who are already on the ground, familiar with everything, and they can implement, at least they can start from implementing small-scale solutions. For example, ELH can implement a menstrual hygiene project where ELH's women group can tackle plastic pollution by creating environmental friendly period pads that can be a source of income for widows. At the same time, like, we can work on supporting farmers which are prone to opium cultivation due to droughts, because the agriculture is very traditional, and we should consult them, guide them, and support them to grow better alternatives such as saffron. So yeah, and networking is really important. Because of the shortage of time, I will not go into other ideas, but just wanted to mention the importance of networking among the scientists, the researchers, the grassroots movements, and other people involved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mateen Saib. Let's go to our last question from Suhail Stanigzai, and then we're going to go to Zohra John for commentary. If you can unmute your mic, Suhail.
Hello. My question is relevant to Mayar Saab and Sadid Saab. So, actually, we are using underground water in some of our provinces for agriculture, not actually for efficient irrigation, rather for flood irrigation. So, actually, my question is that is there any research done that for how long that our underground reserves could last, or in order to avoid the depletion of those reserves? And also, some of the organizations are working on the watershed management and also construction of the check dam. So is this compensation enough for charging those underground water, or this is not enough? And also another question is that we have some large-scale projects that potential projects that like reservoir dam on the Konar River and also like Qushtepa Canal. So what I mean, like if we could implement such projects, so what are the consequences or potential consequences of these projects on our neighboring countries from a political perspective and also environmental perspective? Thank you, over.
Mayarsa, would you like to address this question?
Yeah, thank you very much. This was a lot of questions, but I will briefly answer that groundwater has not been sufficiently investigated in Afghanistan. The exact details of the groundwater aquifers is not available. Only as far as I know, the aquifers around the Kabul city has been mapped and evaluated. But currently, the Ministry of Energy and Water is monitoring the groundwater level in some provinces. Nationally, there is no statistics. The Khosh-Tepa Canal will have some consequences for the downstream countries because it will withdraw a lot of amount of water, and it will also further dry up the Aral Sea, which is located in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. But looking to the withdrawal amount of water of the Central Asia, this is also still a considerable amount, but it will have consequences. My proposed solution was that the Central Asian states support this project to use the water saving technology, and this way it could be the water consumption of this project could be reduced, and some water would be remain for the downstream area. So far that has not been heard, and there are some discussions between Turkmenistan and the current de facto administration, but that are the major issues that I don't like to comment on it here, and yeah, it will cause some consequences to the downstream area. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're going to go to Zora Faizi next. Zora John was in Afghanistan during the floods, and I wanted to hear from Zora John about her experience, her firsthand experience. Zora John, if you can unmute yourself.
And just a quick note, Dr. Zohra is a lecturer at MIT, also a board member at Assem, and while she was there in Afghanistan, she was actually helping the flood victims in Afghanistan. So really appreciate that she can comment on this.
Thank you, Michelle and Tawab. I hope you can hear me. I'm outside.
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So I was in August and September, and my family is actually from Logar, so I ended up really close up to the floods that week. I just wanted to share, I know a lot of people have been sharing firsthand experiences of what this looks like on the ground. And I wanted to add to that conversation because I think when you're far away from the country, it's difficult to understand the severity of what we're dealing with in Afghanistan. On the one hand, my family is split between Kabul and Logar. And in Kabul, there's actually in both provinces, there's very limited drinking water. In fact, people have to, depending on the family, some families travel to other places to bring water. Some families buy water in the city. So there are many, many issues. And then I witnessed the floods as well. It rained for about 2 weeks, almost every single day. And it was much worse in Logar than it was in Kabul. And one night I was very close to Khushi, which was one area that was devastated. I think over, I don't remember the exact numbers, but dozens of people lost their lives and many homes were also destroyed. But I think the overall impact was also on just the agricultural lands. The next morning, when we woke up and went outside, there were apples just everywhere, muddy, that were brought into our area from the neighboring village. And so you see that, farmers spend half of the year cultivating their lands. And then unfortunately at the end, during the summer, you have these devastating climate disasters. On top of that, it's not just flooding. In the 2 months I was there were 2 earthquakes, besides the one in Tektia. And then one thing that we haven't had a chance to talk about, which I think is really important and has a huge impact on health, is also the air quality, particularly in Kabul. And yeah, I don't know if we have time, but I wanted to ask a question about that. Like, what can we do practically to improve the air quality? And I think part of the issue when I visited Afghanistan, one thing that I've noticed is just where people have chosen to live. And I'm not sure how much we can do about that, but Kabul is overpopulated, and I don't know how you could possibly improve the air quality with 6 million people in a very small city. So that was my question, but I don't know if we have time for that. What are some ways we can improve air quality in the city? I also just wanted to hit on one point, which is being very realistic about the actors you have to work with in order to have a real impact in Afghanistan. During the floods, government officials were there. And in fact, I think without their assistance, many more people would have died, would have lost their homes and their lives if they were not there. And so I think we have to work harder to impress on government officials what we're dealing with, and really push for engagement in whatever ways possible. Because if we want to save more lives, that's really the only route.
So I think the question was, how can we improve air quality, because air quality is really poor. Would anybody like to respond to that? I would lean towards Dr. Mayar or Najibullah, but Dr. Mayar, if you can respond to that, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Actually, it's a catastrophic condition right now, but there is very less hope for the solution. First, we can assume that we should reduce the amount of gases that is emitted to the atmosphere of the Kabul. So actually, this is very less probable because the current de facto administration is providing coal in lower price for the people to use it. So this is further intensifying the air quality problems. And on the other side, another side is to observe or to drop down the gases to the ground, and that's possible only with the trees. So that's also not a very urgent solution. The third and only urgent solution could be the possibility of rainfalls that also settle down the particles suspended in the air. So I think this year also there is a La Nina in progress in the Pacific Oceans, but still there is a hope for some rainfalls and snows, and if we have a normal wet season, the air quality will improve. Otherwise, it would be problematic this winter as well.
Thank you, Mayar. I appreciate that information. Yeah, air quality. It's so. When I used to go to Kabul, I literally could not breathe when I walked outside because there was so much dust that it would completely bring about congestion in my sinuses. Really unfortunate, and that seems to continue to happen. We've gone over by quite a bit, so if there are no other comments from the speakers, I'd like to make a closing remark and close the space. Nasratullah, go ahead.
Thank you, Top John. Sorry for even though we have gone over the time, but it's very important. Just want to make one point, that is the complexity of climate change. It has interlinkages with other problems. Whatever we are discussing right now in Afghanistan has a link with climate change and gets exacerbated, whether it's livelihoods, poverty, food insecurity, displacement, sustainable development, and even it has potential for fueling national and regional conflict. So today it was a really great discussion. So thank you to all the organizers and also the speakers. But I really request the organizations to continue the discussion, because today we just touched the surface of the disasters, the crises relating to climate change. So I really look forward to having more discussions on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Nasratullah. So with that said, I would like to make a closing remark, and we could call it a day. First and foremost, I want to thank our esteemed speakers for their time, especially given that we've gone over, and all the listeners who attended. Really appreciate your time, your expertise, your input. The Afghan civilians are suffering today, and I pray that we can put, specifically Afghans, can put our differences aside and prioritize the people of Afghanistan and help the Afghan civilian collectively best we can. To a great extent, the international community has forgotten Afghanistan and its current humanitarian crisis. And at a minimum, the people of Afghanistan should not forget the humanitarian crisis and work towards that cause, towards helping them. We will continue to host such spaces to raise awareness, leverage experts, and ensure that the people of Afghanistan is not collectively punished for a government they did not choose. I know that many people are working to help their families and relatives, but I think more needs to be done given the gravity of the situation. So I urge you to continue helping relatives, family, but also to work collectively to really make a change, especially those Afghans who are in the diaspora and have the means to really raise awareness or tackle some of these challenges. With that said, I know there are other people who requested to ask questions, but unfortunately we ran out of time. And I really, again, can't appreciate all the time that you guys have extended, the speakers and the audience, and we look forward to having you in future spaces. Thank you again. Have a great day, night, morning, wherever you may be.